The High Cloud Quintet is probably the strongest group that we're able to meet in Honkai Star Rail. From Blade to Dan Heng to the deceased Bai Heng. However, by far the two most strongest members are Jingliu and Jing Yuan. While I have talked about their two power before, and I have discussed briefly why I think Jingliu was above Jing Yuan in a previous video, I still think there's a lot of misconceptions that need to be covered to see who is truly the strongest member of the High Cloud Quintet, and to see who truly owns the title of the strongest in the Law of Fu. Especially considering all the misconceptions that I see around this fight. There is a lot for both sides, not just one or the other. I also want to mention that the poll that I created, the Honkai Star Rail scaling video, will be coming out soon. I hope to release it sooner than later, maybe around the end of November or early December, since I want to account for the fact that by that time there's going to be a major update where potentially Honkai Star Rail might be getting some more scaling due to the Honkai Impact 3rd collab. And we will then get to see which parts are canon, which parts are not, and how their scaling will be affected by this. So, let's go back to the video after that. We're going to go essentially in somewhat of a timeline order and cover all the comparisons that they have. But first, before we cover that, I want to cover some specific context, specifically about Jingliu's state, and her state in her past and present, and what is truly her quote-unquote prime, since I really think it's something that has been misconstrued or misconceptualized. A lot of people like to believe the Mara state that she gets as an amp for Jingliu in terms of raw stats. They believe this due to Dan Shu's diary, how others react to the Mara, specifically Blade, and kind of just for no reason as well, they just kind of assert it. But let's go over this specifically. People like to compare it to Blade, even though Blade is a very specific instance. Blade was specifically cursed by the Eon of Abundance due to him trifling with things that allowed Bai Heng to come back to life, leaving her to come back to a zombie, and therefore his curse was this immortality that is, quote, on the level of an Emanator, or quote-unquote having the flesh of an Emanator. It's not specifically that he was a Mara struck that made him this power. It is because he specifically trifled with the Abundance, leading him to specifically get cursed by the Abundance. This is not like every other Mara struck, and therefore shouldn't apply to Jingliu, as Jingliu did not suffer the same curse that Blade did. This curse is also what essentially makes Blade have this strong immortality. While Mara struck in general have a good regeneration immortality, Blade's immortality is specifically noted to be quite exceptional.
Through unexpected circumstances, Blade became immortal. His body recovers from the worst of sicknesses and the gravest of injuries, even from death itself. Those bandages aren't for show. For Blade, immortality isn't a blessing. It's a curse that follows him wherever he goes.
And because due to this curse is very much shown to be above what a normal Mara struck would do to a person. Most of the reason why people get amped from Mara struck anyways is because usually Mara struck turn into monsters that would obviously increase their physical stats if they're becoming from a normal human to these monsters. It makes a lot of sense. However, Jingliu doesn't get this. She only seems to get this. She doesn't seem to get this at all. She obviously doesn't turn into a monster and get these enhanced features. It is never stated directly or indirectly that the Mara struck who are able to resist it to a degree and they'll get turned into outright flesh-eating monsters still get the strength amp or stat amp that logically you'd get from the monster side of things if you could turn into a Mara struck monster. There's also the Yuan diagram that essentially describes as someone who died and someone who became Mara struck, that the person was weak originally and that they became a lot stronger due to the Mara, and a lot of wounds are healed. While yes, Mara definitely does give a regeneration factor, he only became so strong because he originally had health complications, which the regeneration of the Mara fixed. Not specifically because it gave him a stat amp, only because the regeneration fixes health complexes. He literally did not even have a fully working heart. That's how bad these health complications were. However, for Jingliu specifically, not only do we know that the Mara is the same diary, goes on to explain that Mara is an extremely painful process for those who aren't turned into just an outright monster. We know that it specifically causes Jingliu mental problems to where she is mentally at her limit, and I think a mental nerf should affect a physical nerf, as if you are mentally not at your best, logically your physical capabilities would also be nerfed as a result. And we specifically know that Jingliu is not only going through this pain physically, it is shown, not only stated by herself, but shown several times that it is very clearly putting her in a mentally struggling state and outright mentally taxing her. There's no reason for Jingliu specifically to get an amp from the Mara. And even in current times, she actively describes herself as rusty in comparison to her past self. So essentially the ranking would go the current Jingliu, then the Mara struck Jingliu, that when she first got Mara struck, and then a prime Jingliu would actually be when in her high cloud Quintet days, when she was just a normal swordsman and essentially at her peak. This will become a lot more obvious later when we start comparing their feats and what they've actually done. For Jing Yuan, he's likely become unquantifiably stronger and more experienced than his past. However, he had Lightning Lord pretty early on and always had it for anything relevant that's described situation. He had it during the High Cloud Quintet days, and he had it during when Jingliu got Mara struck and escaped. And nothing specifically states that Jing Yuan got a huge amp or something big happened that increased his strength from when he was in his High Cloud Quintet days to now. It's just kind of logically, he should get unquantifiably stronger, but since there's something directly stating it, we can't assume it's anything relevant or anything that would suddenly make the gap between them to where, for example, if Jingliu scales above a High Cloud Quintet Jing Yuan, it doesn't apply to a current Jing Yuan to any meaningful degree. And the only way you can really argue it is narrative implication, but we'll get to that later. But let's start with their comparison, starting with the very first comparison I like to mention, Hoolay, the Borisan leader. Hoolay is the Borisan leader that not only in the past, but currently was going to go on a rage from the Luofu and was stopped twice. While differing accounts vary from the original account of how Hoolay was defeated, the most consistent idea is that Jingliu just one-shot Hoolay and instantly defeated him, with her story saying that she just cut off his head, and the relic says saying she cut off a hand and he was knocked out from that single strike. This is backed up by Hoolay still currently being incredibly afraid of Jingliu, to where when Jakui mentions Jingliu to Hoolay immediately switches up his plans from trying to immediately go on a rampage to Luofu to actually staying back, and doesn't actually go through his plan until he learns that Jakui was lying. So this would essentially propose that Jingliu would essentially be one shot above Hoolay, like a lot above Hoolay, to the point where she could just casually one shot him. Jing Yuan, on the other hand, thinks Hoolay is a huge problem. He thinks of Hoolay as not only extremely threatening, and one of the biggest threats, if not the biggest threats that Luofu has faced, maybe on the likes of Fanalia, if not above. But even thinks if Jingliu wasn't there, or I guess Fei Xiao wasn't there, as we'll later learn, Hoolay would just rampage across Luofu, and no one else would really be able to take him down. Once again, the only one really excluded from the statement is Fei Xiao, as Fei Xiao was literally blatantly above Hoolay. And Fei Xiao is consistently stated to be not only a better general than Jing Yuan, to be outright above him combat-wise, and it's shown directly too. So Jing Yuan doesn't upscale off of Fei Xiao like other people think anyways. So already we have Jingliu being massively above Hoolay, who Hoolay at the least is comparable to Jing Yuan, if just not outright above him. By that point, once again, he should already have Lightning Lord and be an Emanator. And once again, still currently, he still views Hoolay as this massive threat. And once again, this same Hoolay still views himself as massively inferior to Jingliu. I think it's pretty obvious where the implications start from. And once again, this would also kind of back up this previous idea that Jingliu in her past before the Mara struck is a lot superior than her current self. Speaking of the Emanators in general, people like to argue that because of the narrative, that Emanators are above Path Striders automatically, or the generals are above everyone else. In which, for the Path Striders and Emanators point, yes, I would actually agree. Most times an Emanator should be above a Path Strider. However, there can be exceptions. The general narrative isn't really stated or shown anywhere for the general point, unless you want to believe rank equals power, which is never stated, as we see with the IPC. Jade, who is a higher rank than Adventurine, is quite literally featless in combat, compared to the weakened Adventurine 5v1 in the Astral Express, including people like Welt, only losing due to Acheron going all out. And it applies a lot in fiction, a rank not always being related to power, that's explicitly stated. Once again, the Emanator thing is a lot more consistent as is actually stated, as Emanators are an amp and essentially Eon's power compared to the average Pathstrider. However, we do have some notions that could contradict this. Not only do we have a base Sam, who is specifically trying to just draw Acheron, Black Swan, and the Trailblazer away, and not even outright do any fatal damage to them, still hold his own and be fine in a 3v1 against a base Acheron, Black Swan, and the Trailblazer. The Trailblazer isn't an Emanator, but Black Swan and Acheron are, and while Acheron isn't using her true power, Acheron without using her true power is still well an Emanator, and Black Swan was using her true power. So this would essentially give credence to the idea that there can be exceptions to this idea that you can be above an Emanator as a Pathstrider if you're just strong enough. And we even see in the High Code Quintet, once again, not an Emanator, has quote-unquote flesh on the level of an Emanator, which Jingliu is constantly just able to stab through him, kill him multiple times. Jingliu and Blade are not comparable in the slightest, to where even when current Jingliu was holding back specifically against Blade, she literally did not view him as a threat. Jingliu knocks Blade around and essentially beats Blade up horrendously. So this idea of, once again, Jingliu, this eminent idea not mattering to Jingliu, makes sense. And even just on a baseline, Emanators are extremely amped Pathstriders, that's what they are. That's why they're considered above the average Pathstrider. It's not like every Emanator has to always be above every Pathstrider. An Emanator is just a amped Pathstrider. But if you are already a really strong Pathstrider, and already are on the level of an Emanator, then a normal-ass Pathstrider being amped to an Emanator wouldn't really matter for you, since you're already on that level. Take it as, like, JJK and Godzilla. Yuji, for example, obviously gets massively stronger as the series progresses. He grows a lot, learns two new techniques, trains, even awakens and learns some Sukuna's move. Does this mean he's suddenly on the level of Gojo and Sukuna, even though they have had far less amps and far less training than Yuji has? Not at all. Or Godzilla. Godzilla amps himself a shit ton to fight against Shimo. He gets a power plant amp, and then he amps himself and evolve from the literal strongest source of energy on the planet, and yet, while base and evolved, he still couldn't beat Shimo, and Shimo didn't even amp herself at all. It's the same idea here. The amp didn't close the gap between the two, and we see this. And considering the gap was literally the fact that Yuan was her student, then I think it makes a lot of sense to have a big, huge fucking gap. And even if Yuan got a big-ass amp, no reason for this gap to close, and once again, this is going to get a lot more consistent later. Even the idea of these narrative implications are quite silly, and a lot of narrative implications are just fancy words for making an interpretation. They're really not as big as you think. It's basically just an assumption someone makes. A narrative implication on its own does not beat a statement or a feat or a fact we know about the story. Those will always outweigh someone's assumption or interpretation, which all of these arguments for Yuan pretty much are. Once again, we go back to the Godzilla and JJK analogies. Yuji is narratively supposed to be Sukuna level. He's consistently even stated this, and this is the idea presented in the narrative. Yet he obviously doesn't have the feats to back this up, more or less even someone like Gojo. Mechagodzilla, once again, is narratively portrayed to be someone on Godzilla's level, maybe even his equal or superior considering what his creator says. Yet he struggles with Godzilla and Kong when they're weakened, and several sources Mechagodzilla isn't really on this level. A narrative will just never outright beat direct feats and showings. because a narrative is just a fancy word for an interpretation or assumption that a person will make. And this usually is the case. If a narrative, quote unquote, is backed up by feats or statements, then yes, it's fine. But in this case, it really isn't. So why use it? Why argue it? Even with this narrative logic, Jingliu is actually directly stated several times to be the strongest and the peak of the High Cloud Quintet, being the peak to the point where she was the reason why the High Cloud Quintet is known in legend for being so powerful. It was all her, which, considering this is directly stated by objective sources, it's a lot more narratively consistent, quote unquote, than the implications that people argue for Yuan. Other than Jingliu being the peak of the quintet, we know in the past that Jing was able to 3v1 the alive members of the High Cloud Quintet, including Yuan, with Lightning Lord to mind you. But people like to say the blades in the ground in this scene mean more in the metaphorical sense. If it was metaphorical, don't you think it'd be a lot more sense that Jingliu and Bai Heng's blades would be in the ground if they're trying to quote unquote metaphorically show the High Cloud Quintet splitting up? And also, the idea of blades being put in the ground or weapons being put in the ground is usually a sign of a character being defeated or a remnant of a character that has been defeated, especially before the original flashback showing Yuan and Jingliu fighting. This backs up the idea more. So Jingliu 3v1'd and won a fight against Yuan, Blade, and Dan Heng. Or I guess I should say Dan Feng in this context, since it was, the past. And this once again further supports the idea of her past self being above her current self. Next, timeline-wise, we move on to the Flash Emanators short. Obviously, we have covered Jingliu's state by this point. This fight would take place after Yuan got his general status anyways, and this would be after Jingliu got Mara struck. People, for some reason, like to argue Yuan was holding back when...
To become stricken with Mara is to be a long-life species. If I too become stricken in times hereafter, you must not hold back.
Yes, Master.
The short literally says he wasn't. It flat out says, if she became Mara struck, that he would not hold back. You are arguing with his own words. You are arguing with the short itself. You literally cannot argue against it if it is outright fucking stated. There's no contradiction to this statement either. None. Physically in this fight as well, Jingliu is dominating Yuan, running circles around him. She's clearly much faster and much stronger. This is the evident point of the fight. To the point where even guides go on to say that Jingliu was overwhelming compared to Yuan's power. The only reason that Yuan actually won this fight was because he summons Lightning Lord, and for some reason she just stands there, obviously implying that she let herself get defeated. That makes a lot of sense unless you think Jingliu is stupid. Why else would she stand there? She doesn't stand there the entire fight. She just stands here and visibly looks much different than her more aggressive stance in the fight. It's quite obvious that she's letting herself get defeated. And the short even backs us up by showing her right before this being in a more mental confliction, which once again backs up the previous idea that this Mara is mentally conflicting her and mentally nursing her. So once again, this obviously not prime Jingliu can fight and outspeed and overpower a full power Yuan. The only thing Yuan can do is summon Lightning Lord, and not only is it quite obvious that Jingliu can just dodge if she wanted to, Jingliu could probably just kill Yuan before he activates Lightning Lord anyways in a fight, if both are going all out. Since we know Yuan was going all out from the start of this fight, as directly stated. And even if Jingliu has her own technique, that would be a quote-unquote one-shot technique if you think Lightning Lord can literally one-shot Jingliu. The time and space slashing strike that legends tell her she can use, which is confirmed it's not a legend, she can outright do it. There's no reason for this to not be an outright one-shot on Yuan if you think Lightning Lord is a one-shot on Jingliu. it would essentially bypasses their ability being a space-time strike that cuts through it. Now we're at the end, the current cycle, which doesn't have many scaling chains between the two. Both are above Dan Heng IL and Blade as they always have been. Nothing's really changed in that department. Something to even note though, currently, Jingliu in context, and so does Luocha, still refer to Jingliu as his superior, as Jingliu superior, as his master. This isn't just them referring to the past. They literally refer to currently her as still his master, as still his superior, someone who is above him. This is backed up by the guards stating that after Jingliu let herself be captured, that no one would allow themselves to be captured that no one else could capture her on the Luofu, implying no one else can beat her directly, including Yuan, who was quite literally in the room with them. And also, Jingliu is just considered the strongest sword master on the Luofu outright. So in conclusion, I think it's quite obvious that even currently, Jingliu is just much stronger than pretty much any form of Jingliu. No matter how you look at it, any form of Jingliu should pretty much be dogging on Jingliu. And I hope this clears any misconceptions people have about the fight. But if you have any concerns, questions, comments, or contentions, please feel free to leave it in the comments, and I'll give my thoughts on it below. Make sure to like, subscribe, and follow for more content. Peace.